Initials for clarity. Me, 24M me. My mother, 50F mom. My brother, 23M bro. My sister, 30F sis. Cheating stepdad, 45M Chris. Stepdad's coworker, 25F Betty. The other woman, 40F Darla. This may be a long one, apologies in advance. I moved in with my mom after her marriage of 25 years with my biological dad ended. He was a manipulative jerk, but that's another story. Shortly after the divorce, my mom introduced me to her boyfriend at the time, Chris. Now, my mom worked as a correctional officer at the county jail. The boyfriend, Chris, was a former inmate, in for a DUI. That should have been the first red flag, but my mom was grieving a long marriage, and I didn't want to push the subject. Chris seemed to make her happy, and that was enough for me. Me, bro, and sis all moved in with mom and Chris, and we all seemed to get along. Chris and I bonded a bit over our love of video games, and all seemed well. That is, until 2017. Due to Chris's previous DUI, he had to attend probation checkups at the courthouse regularly. One day, he didn't come back, and we started to worry. Later, we received a phone call from him, not from the courthouse, but from Texas. It turns out that when he arrived at the courthouse that day, he was ambushed by the FBI. Chris's family in Texas was implicated in several gang and drug-related crimes, and due to a situation where he was in a vehicle during a drug handoff, he was also implicated. Chris agreed to testify against his family members in exchange for a lighter sentence, allowing him to stay out of prison until the trial. My mom was devastated, but they managed to keep their relationship alive over a year of phone calls and worked out marriage plans for when he returned. His store owner at Dairy Queen even allowed him to return to his job as store manager. However, soon after his return, the drinking started. Now, obviously with his DUI history, Chris was no stranger to alcohol. He started drinking more and more until he was consuming half a 24-pack of beer every day. Chris was a mean drunk. He often picked fights when he was wasted, and though these fights never got physical, he certainly wasn't kind with his words. My mom enabled this behavior for years, claiming that the stress from his job and the upcoming trial was too much for him. Eventually, after years of this, my mom had had enough. One night, Chris came home extremely drunk, and my mom confronted him. She asked if he had been drinking, and when he didn't deny it, she kicked him out. He went to stay with a friend temporarily. The next morning, my mom asked us to help gather his essentials so that he wouldn't have to return to the house until he sobered up. As we were gathering his belongings, there was a knock on the door. It was Betty, one of Chris's co-workers, and someone I went to high school with. She told my mom that she had something important to share. After sitting my mom down and asking her not to reveal her source, Betty disclosed that Chris had been cheating on my mom with Darla. She went on to explain how Chris regularly had Darla perform sexual acts around his workplace. Betty had caught them and was threatened by Chris, who said that if she ever told my mom, he would fire her since he was the store manager. Betty also revealed that Darla was pregnant. My mom was furious. Once the initial shock wore off, she told us to gather all of Chris's belongings and dump them outside. We removed everything he owned from the house and tossed it all into the alley behind our home. Chris had no legal claim to the house. It was rented, and only my mom was on the paperwork, so he had no right to return. My mom called Chris and confronted him. He admitted to the entire affair and went on to say that he was actually happy that Darla was pregnant because it meant he would finally have a child of his own. My mom had refused to have more kids due to the strain it had put on her body. Chris showed no remorse for his actions. My mom arranged for him to collect his items from the alley with a police officer present, and that was the last we saw of him. The revenge. Though my mom was eager to wash her hands of the situation and move on, my siblings and I had different plans. First, we called his workplace. Dairy Queen operates as an independently owned franchise, and the owner of the branches Chris worked at was a family friend. We informed him about the sexual acts that had taken place on the premises, and he took the necessary steps to have Chris fired from his position. Chris was also banned from working at any of the Dairy Queen locations in the area. Funnily enough, Betty took over his position and now runs a much tighter and cleaner operation. With no job and no place to live, Chris went to stay with Darla in a town about an hour away. We later discovered that he had started working at another Dairy Queen in that town, so we contacted the owner of that location as well. This time, it took longer since there weren't any indecent acts taking place at this new location. But eventually, Chris lost that job too. After losing both his jobs, Chris started driving around our neighborhood, seemingly stalking my mom and our family. Since he never had his DUI probation lifted, he didn't have a valid driver's license. When he lived with us, he didn't need to drive because his work was local, and we drove him around as needed. But now he was driving alone, which was a violation. We contacted the police and informed them about the car that was frequently spotted in our neighborhood, which belonged to Darla, and we explained that Chris was likely driving without a license. We asked them to pull the vehicle over if they saw it again, as it would likely be Chris behind the wheel. Sure enough, a few weeks later, we received word that Chris had been pulled over and sent to the local jail for driving without a license and while intoxicated. The police also conducted a search of the home he was staying in and found several firearms on the premises. Since Chris was a felon, he was not legally allowed to possess any weapons, which added more jail time to his sentence. By the time his jail time was up, it was just in time for him to be sent back to Texas for his trial. Chris's son was born while he was in prison. Darla realized what a terrible person Chris was and broke ties with him while he was still incarcerated. During his time in prison, Chris sent countless letters to my mom, apologizing and begging her to take him back, though he also tried to shift the blame for his actions, all in the same letters. My mom burned every letter he sent. Eventually, we moved out of state and started fresh. Chris has since been released from prison and now lives in Kansas. He's been struggling, mainly fighting child support payments that Darla sued him for. My mom, on the other hand, has a new boyfriend who treats her with the love and respect she deserves. My brother and sister have moved out, and I still live with my mom, helping her with the renovations on the new home we bought. Life is much better now. This whole saga came to mind during a conversation with a coworker about cheaters, so I thought I'd share it here for others to enjoy.